Tangyaria, Nadu Yinjamara, Ioramai, Nadu Yinjamara, Gadigal Gare, Nuremberg. Welcome to Q&A. I wanted to pay my respects to the people of the Eora Nation and the land of the Gadigal people on where we're meeting tonight. If we ban the Nazi salute, what else needs to go? And life on other planets, what does it teach us about this one? We've got some very big thinkers on our panel. World-renowned physicist and best-selling author Greene, who is about to tour Australia. Independent MP for Fowler, Dai Lee, the first independent to hold that seat. Minister for Defence Personnel and Veterans Affairs, Matt Keogh. Wiradjuri woman and science communicator, Kirsten Banks. And human rights lawyer, academic author and broadcaster, Geoffrey Robertson.
Can anyone explain what we saw in Melbourne on the weekend in regards to the Nazi salute, and how is that okay?
Matt.
Well, I almost can't explain it because I think all of us were really quite shocked, Eric, by what we saw in Melbourne. I think across Australia and indeed wherever that would have been seen around the world, to think that well into the 21st century, well after the Second World War, that we would see Australian people making that sort of sign and conveying that sort of message was not just shocking, it was deeply disturbing and of course very offensive. And so whilst we are very fortunate to live in a country that has freedom of speech and freedom of political expression, and we allow people to protest peacefully, and all of those things should be protected. What we saw displayed in Melbourne over the weekend, I think, has really troubled people, and understandably, and that's why I think we've seen now today the Dan Andrews government react in the way that they have around legislating against this.
There's various legislation in other states, and of course there's been legislation or laws against Nazi insignia. What about at a federal level? Is something needed?
Well, I think it's something that fits within the remit of state governments to do, so it probably doesn't need an additional overlay. It's not something that I have looked at, to be honest, Grant, but if there's a gap, then we would need to look at that. But it's that sort of activity is something that would generally fit in the remit of state parliaments.
Di, how did you feel watching that on the weekend?
Look, I think it was quite troublesome, as the Minister said. We do have the anti-discrimination law in Australia. I think that it's in 2023, and we still have that. I think the people who did that were very irresponsible, and I think that we should not obviously accept that, and we should speak out about that.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be outlawed. Right? I mean, when you start limiting freedom of speech, that's a slippery slope, which at some point in the future can so easily be turned to suppress the minority. It's not about outlawing it. It's about public shaming it. It's about educating the young so that as they grow up, they don't do it. I mean, what's more powerful, outlawing it or having, say, a 15-year-old daughter see her father on the news undertaking this act and saying, "Dad, oh my God, was that you?" What's more powerful? It's really education. It's not outlawing.
Brian is a Jewish person as well. Person of Jewish
I am
heritage.
Jewish, but I'm not saying this as a Jewish person. I'm saying this as a human being.
So you're saying it as an American. America doesn't.
That's exactly right.
You ask a German, they ban Nazi insignia because they lived under the Nazis. You ask any countryman from Europe, they ban it. Britain doesn't. But gosh, when you're a judge, you can increase the sentence if there's a race-related motive.
Should it be banned, though?
You've got to be very careful in drafting your law, because you have to, otherwise you're going to be banning Charlie Chaplin and the Great Dictator.
Yeah.
So it's not easy. And what is important is
that you can draft something that goes to outlawing something that is such a hateful act, represents
if it's
something
intended to cause hatred.
So how do you do that effectively?
Well, you just say intended to cause hatred in your law. But I think we need to go further. There were 30 young men in black, total black, in front of the Victorian Parliament. It'd be nice to know where they came from. Are they the St Kilda Young Liberals, imitating Mr Perrottet when he was 20? We don't. So be careful what you wish for in this. We need to tackle the causes that are producing, from under a rock, these people. And interestingly enough, it was in support of someone who was ratcheting up hatred against trans people. And I think that's the key. If you need Nazis to support your cause, it's a rotten cause.
I'll just come to Kirsten. This is my best. I want to pursue this with you, Geoffrey, as well, because we know that there are bans at a state or territory level against public displays of Nazi symbols. It exists in New South Wales. That come into force in 2022. Queensland government plans to introduce proposed laws to ban Nazi symbols as well, including tattoos. Other states are looking at this. It does then raise the question, what else, doesn't it? For instance, you talked about the United States. Does a Confederate flag, which can be so associated with slavery and racism, a symbol that the Ku Klux Klan used, also be banned? Does that also raise that question, Geoffrey?
Yes, of course. And America has dealt with it on the whole sensibly when Trump left office, and is now moving a lot of these old statues to museums where they belong as part of the history of racism in America. And one could say it in Australia, where our history of racism, going back to the founding fathers, who they all thought like Pauline Hanson, and they were, the first law they ever passed was the White Australia policy, and you had people like Alfred Deakin, who actually told the country that Aboriginals would be erased
Within 100 years.
No more tinted people. So that was the
Well, that didn't
kind
work.
of people.
It didn't work. We're here,
Didn't work.
Kirsten.
We're still
We're here.
here.
So how do you feel about that as a Wiradjuri woman, taking into account what we saw on the weekend, what Geoffrey has to say, but also the point that Brian made, that banning it may not be the way to go?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because I do want to come back to what you said, Brian, is making I guess, a mockery of these people, yes, a very good learning opportunity for those watching, but why are we letting it get to that point? Why aren't we stopping it before these things kind of happen, so we don't have these big spectacles and we don't have people walking the streets fearing for their lives? And if you look at the footage, who was being protected that day? That's a really big question that I think is really important here too. You look at the footage and it's the people who are being directly threatened with their lives who are being pushed away, and didn't look like they were actually being protected by the police force that were there.
I'll put that to Brian, just in response to that, if it's who deserves protection, I suppose, people protected from hateful symbols and hate speech, or people's right to actually express those views?
Unfortunately, both. Because the only way that you can have a true democracy is if you protect hateful speech, as long as it's not immediately inciting illegal act, as long as it's not immediately inciting some kind of destructive activity. But beyond that, it's through education. It's through the cultural environment that you want to change attitudes so that there isn't an uprising of that sort. That's a more powerful, more lasting approach than just making a ban. Because if you make a ban, you're not changing the hearts and minds of the very people whose act you are now trying to ban. They've got the same mindset, and in fact, for some, it'll fire them up and have more who want to follow in their footsteps merely because they want to go against the authority, the legislative ban. So there's an underlying problem, and that's what needs to be addressed more systemically than just saying, let's ban the activity.
I'll just go back to Eric, because Eric, this is something that's close to your family as well. Your father had lived through Nazi occupation.
Yeah, so he was a Dutch teenager and got sent to a labour camp in Germany during World War II. And he never forgot the war.
How do you feel on that question? We've raised both sides of this, whether banning it is a right idea or the wrong idea. Where do you land?
Not being rude to the gentleman next to you, but I think Australia's a little bit smarter. Like, we've got our issues in Australia, and I understand he doesn't want to ban it, but I don't know. Like, have a look at the equality in the room here. Like, I feel Australian cities, we get on pretty well.
I'd like to bring in a couple of people who have experienced this as a family. Alison and Dave Whitfield are joining us from Greene in Brisbane. Nice to have you with us.
Hi, Sam.
Dave, you served in East Timor, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And the impact has stayed with you. Could you share with us what the impact of serving there was and how you still live with that?
Okay, well, try to make it short. I have very serious dreams every night, nightmares every night. I'm in full body pain constantly. I would say even my eyelids hurt. Just the memories of a few things that happened in there. I was a medic as well. I served over there, so saw a few things and did a few things that some other people may not have done. You know.
I wonder how you feel, Dave.
And also probably tried to commit suicide more times than I can count, 30 plus times.
Alison, what's it been like for you then as a wife to see this? I mean, it's just, I'm sorry to hear you have to say that, Dave, and I'm sorry for what you've gone through, and particularly in service of our country. What's it like, Alison, in that situation?
You say wife, and if I was just a wife, it'd be good. But I am Dave's carer, counsellor, psychiatrist, psychologist, doctor,
She's my everything.
Chemist, everything.
She's my everything.
I cut him down when he's hanging from the roof. I perform CPR when he's overdosed. I know I've done that many times. And until we got help from the Veterans Centre of Australia, and now that's been closed, there's nowhere for us to go. There is no inpatient care in Australia for disabled suicide veterans anymore.
Alison, I'm so sorry to hear you have to say that, and there's no words to even respond to what you've had to go through. I'm just wondering when you talk about no support services, that you don't have what you need, what's your question, particularly because we have a minister here tonight that you can put a question directly to?
Yeah. My question is, I'm actually offering you an invitation, Mr. Keogh, to be a guest in our home and experience firsthand the crisis resulting in your government's neglect of Australian veterans and their families by closing the Veterans Centre Australia. This is an invitation as a guest. However, it is bring your own food because DVAs and cap payments don't pay for extra mouths other than mine and Dave's.
Really?
I'd like you to really, I don't want you to send your secretary or your offsider. I'd like you to come to our home to experience it firsthand.
Matt?
That veteran centre meant everything to a lot of veterans, and it saved a lot of veterans' lives, including Dave's. He wouldn't be sitting here now if it wasn't for that centre. And to you, he might be Joe Blow, but to me, he's my husband who signed up and served for this country, and he's everything.
Of course.
Maybe not to you, but to me he is, and he deserves better. And so do a lot of other veterans.
Matt?
Well, firstly, can I say to Alison and to Dave, and Dave, thank you for your service, and Alison, thank you for your service in looking after Dave. And as I said in the Parliament when responding to the interim report from the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide, it is really clear that governments, both sides, over a long period of time, have dropped the ball in many ways in how we support our veteran community when they're in need. And some have been very happy with the support that they've received, and great work's been done. And I know the staff of DVA are very committed to that, but it doesn't work every time.
But there's a very clear invitation made from Alison's heart here as well to you to say to come and visit, to sit down.
And I'm happy to get in. I'm happy to be in touch with them, and if we can get Alison and details, then we can certainly arrange something there. But I think just to go to the Veteran Centre that was being spoken about as well, it's a really sad circumstance that's arisen there. It was a small centre working in the North Shore of Sydney, and it grew, which was great, but it didn't seem to be able to put together a sort of a sustainable funding model around it. We certainly provided quite a deal of funding, but unfortunately, it came to a circumstance where that board decided to make a decision to close. But we worked, as in the Department of Veterans Affairs, very closely with them to make sure that all of their existing client base could be connected to other appropriate services.
Well, we have two people here who are part of that.
Yep.
Is that what's happened in your case, Alison? Do you believe that you now have the services that you need after that closure?
No. Dave's last attempt, we waited 9 days for a bed to become available in an inpatient care centre. 9 days. I had to tie myself to my husband so he wouldn't have any more attempts on his life at night while we slept. I tied myself to him.
Yeah. And that reflects a...
And also, Mr. Keogh, recently you spoke at a public forum and about the crisis, and you said to write to the health minister.
What I was speaking about when I was asked about white card access was that I am engaging with the health minister about where veterans are finding a lack of service available to them, and I am working with the Department of Health and the health minister around what we need to do for those veterans that are finding difficulty in accessing a doctor that will service them under the white card. But the broader issue you've raised is a really important one, which is the Department of Veterans Affairs funds services. We will connect you to a service, we'll pay for those services, but we don't run hospitals, we don't run inpatient clinics, that is not something the government does. It's reliant upon the existence and accessibility of either state systems or private. We will pay for to go private, but we do have a broader problem across the country where there is a lack of that service. And that we see that in different parts of the country, and especially in regional areas. And that is a huge problem that confronts people when they need help now, and I'm aware of that, and I'm really sorry that it's impacted the way that it has, and if we can get your details, I'm very happy to be in touch.
So as a product of the Vietnam War myself, and thank you, Alison and David, for sharing your story, I think we've just witnessed the human suffering of wars. And I think that we can't, for any government to invest putting money aside to get us prepared to go to war, they must put aside money, because there will be bound to be people like David and his wife and his family who will need that support when they come back here when you go to war. When you go to war, you see things that you don't want to see, and you do things that you don't want to do, because war forces you to kill, war forces you to do the most horrendous things. So from my perspective, as government put aside this kind of money, unfathomable money, to go and prepare, they need to prepare for the human impact as well of that.
Alison, Dave, thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. And I don't know if this is even good enough, but the best of luck to you, and the love that you have for each other has really shone through tonight. Dave, thank you again for what you've done for our country, and thank you again for being able to share that story with us tonight, and hopefully we can see a better outcome. We're going to stay with this, and we're going to follow this up as well, and you've had a commitment from the Minister here tonight to follow this with you. Thank you again. Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just say as well, yes, please. Thank you. Yeah, extraordinary story. When we talk about conflict, to actually see the human cost of that and to see the impact it has is worth keeping in mind, isn't it, when we talk about numbers and submarines and preparing for war. If this discussion is raising any difficulty for you or anyone you know, the numbers for Lifeline and Open Arms are there on your screen. So please utilise those if you need.
Evening, Geoffrey.
Hi.
My question to you is, you've been selected by the International Criminal Court in The Hague to be lead counsel for the defence of Vladimir Putin on war crimes. Go.
Well,
No pressure.
Your Honours, my client is guilty. But his defence, and you understand international lawyers speak in Latin as often as they can, his defence is the tu quoque defence. I did it, but you, my prosecutors, did it too. Do you remember 20 years ago,
The Iraq War.
That was the crime of aggression, of which Putin, of course, is guilty beyond reasonable doubt. The crime of aggression was committed by the American president, by the British Prime Minister. And there was a little fellow there, popped up occasionally, not very well known, called John Howard. He committed Australia, and there were 27 casualties we suffered, not as much as the others, but he committed Australia to an assault on a state, to the crime of aggression. So that would be Putin's defence. Were I a judge, I would point out that two wrongs don't make a right, and the technical fact that the crime of aggression only entered the law, international law, in 2017. So technically, the aggression that the Allies committed was before that. But today, there is no doubt that he's guilty as charged of, we can see the pictures of Mariupol, 1,000 people, children in particular, killed in the theatre. We can see pictures of the bombed buildings. Undoubtedly, he knew, and the ones who did the bombing knew, that there would be civilian casualties and deaths, and they intended those deaths. And under international law, we have a doctrine called command responsibility, and which targets him as commander for not only permitting and approving these acts, but for taking no action to investigate or punish the war criminals who did it.
We should also point out that he won't stand for trial with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, because Russia is not a signatory, nor is the United States, nor is China.
Well, that's true, but it's interesting that indictment has been the prelude to the fall of Milosevic, Pinochet, Charles Taylor. I signed Charles Taylor's indictment, and we didn't get him. He ran Liberia, and then he paid enough money to stay in Nigeria until his money ran out, and then he was surrendered. He is now in prison for life in Britain. But there comes that question that Putin's moral authority will be undermined. And as well, he can't travel to 123 countries. And in time, you may see him. It took 20 years to get hold of some of the butchers of the Balkans. But in time, we may see him hobbling into a court like some old Nazi, or he may suffer a coup from his own generals, certainly if Russia suffers as much as it's currently suffering from casualties.
Good evening. My question is the political cycle long enough to create leaders that think about the future?
Yes or no, Geoffrey? There you go.
Not with 8 years in power, but we don't want them to have any longer in power. Look, we have a day where a couple of days ago Vladimir Putin was indicted. Tomorrow, Donald Trump says he's being indicted. Does that mean, Brian, that there is a God?
Only if he's convicted.
Yes or no, Matt? I mean, you've
3 years is too short. We should move to fixed 4-year terms at a federal sphere, like all the states have clarity about what the date is that we hold elections. Everyone can plan around it. It will give more breadth for governments to think.
I agree. 3 years is not enough. You get in and then you start discussing things and then you go into election already.
Depends who's in office, I suppose you'll say, Brian.
No, I would say that I think in terms of billions of years, so none of this.
A physicist's answer to a political question. Thank you, Matty. That's all we have time for. Please thank our panel again. Brian Greene, Di Lee, Matt Keogh, Kirsten Banks and Geoffrey Robertson. Thank you for sharing your questions. Thank you again for sharing your stories tonight. I think we got a glimpse into how other people struggle with so many things, and the things that we can often talk about in quite a blasé way land with real consequences for people. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that vulnerability with us. Next week, we're live again from Sydney, and joining me, South Australian Premier Peter Malinauskas, Country Liberal Senator for NT Jacinta Price, and Greens Senator for WA Jordan Steele-John, former Secretary of the US Navy, we talked about him tonight, Richard Spencer. So we're going to be going back to AUKUS again next week. Head to our website to register to be in the audience. Until then, thank you again. Have a good night.